Romans 6:1. What shall we say then? Shall we go on sinning so that grace may increase? Remember at the beginning I said that the book of Romans is really a defense against charges made by the Jews? This is one of the charges. Since Paul is saying that we're saved by grace and not by works, then they're saying, well, why don't you just party down? Just sin and have fun. And in chapter 6, Paul is going to answer that charge. When we first started, I mentioned how King James refused for the translators to translate some words into English. Apostle was one of the words. Well, another word is the word baptism. We think that's an English word, but it isn't. They took each letter of the Greek and turned it into the English letter, and that's baptism. On a side note, another word that was not translated into English was parable, which means story or illustration. Before we actually get into chapter 6, it's important that we understand what the word baptism really means in the Greek. Now you're probably thinking, the King James was written 400 years ago. So how come they haven't translated it in all the modern translations? Well, let me tell you a sad story. In English, if I say, hey guys, let's go to the store. Guys is a male word, but there could be women in that group. If I say mankind needs to deal with the weather, they need to deal with the climate crisis, I'm not talking about just men. We're really saying humanity. Well, the same is true in the Greek. There are a lot of Greek words that are male, but oftentimes are clearly referring to both men and women. In the last chapter, Romans 5:12, in the King James Version. Wherefore, as by one man sin entered into the world, and death by sin, and so death passed upon all men, for that all have sinned. Well, we know that death by sin passed on to women too. So really that should be translated as passed upon all people. They produced a version of the Bible called the TNIV 2005 revision. And it tried to deal with this. And it got soundly rejected by most denominations, and they condemned it. It was like, oh, those liberals, they're trying to make the Bible gender neutral. And so it didn't sell. One of the translators said, no, we're not trying to make it gender neutral. We're trying to make it gender accurate. But it didn't make any difference. The version went down in flames. Nobody bought it. What this means is translators had to be aware of the politics of translation. They tend to be very, very conservative because when they finish their translation, it has to sell. I mean, that seems kind of crude, but the translation has to sell. People have to buy it. So the translators tend to be very, very conservative. And so many times, even though they would like to translate something in one way, unless there's really a really strong reason to do so, they don't. And that's why 400 years later, apostle has not really been translated, baptism has not really been translated, and we still talk about parables. Don't be fooled in thinking that the word baptism is always about water. Oftentimes it has nothing to do with water. The word came from the cloth dyeing industry, so it can mean dipped, or it can mean dunked, or it took on a symbolic meaning. Since the cloth took on the color of the dye, one of the meanings became identification. So that if something was so thoroughly merged into something that it became one with what it was merged with, just like the cloth took on the color of the dye. So they would say that a city that was totally destroyed was baptized in destruction. Or if somebody was totally in debt, they would say he was baptized into debt. So the word meant that you were merged and surrounded and totally soaked in whatever it was. This is going to be the meaning of the word in chapter 6. 1 Corinthians 10:2. They were all baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. Well, Moses didn't get wet, and the people didn't get wet. So this has nothing to do with water. This has to do with the third use of the word. The people became identified with Moses through the miracles of the cloud and the parting of the sea. Mark 10:38. You don't know what you're asking, Jesus said. Can you drink the cup that I drink, or be baptized with the baptism I am baptized with? Clearly, he isn't saying he's going to be water baptized again. The word is being used with his coming death. So, to conclude, don't get caught by thinking every time that you see the word baptism that it's talking about the ritual of baptism. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. And actually, as we'll see, most of the cases in Paul's writing don't refer to water baptism. They're referring to something very different.